we got a piece of feedback where the person, we have thumb up and thumb down in product. The person thumbed up it and said something like, this answer made me feel good. And we get that back. And one of our engineers is like he was like really moved. He was like, wow, like this is really lovely. Because we sort of personify the AI a little bit. And he looks at me and this engineer, he's like, well, I guess, I don't know why this surprises me because lawyers are people too. And I remember just being like, yes, well, of course we're people. Like, what are you talking about? Don't let people tell you you're just a lawyer. Particularly if you're in your house, you are not just a lawyer. And you're only just a lawyer if you think you're just a lawyer.
How should GCs and legal teams be leveraging generative AI? Where do you get started? What mistakes should you avoid? Where is the AI revolution leading? Okay, the last one's kind of a big question, but today we are joined on the abstract by my friend Cecilia Ziniti, founder and CEO of GCAI. GCAI is a generative AI interface designed specifically for in-house counsel. It's a product that Cecilia always wanted. She has deep experience building and leading legal functions in tech, including most recently as GC and head of business development at Replit. She has also led legal teams or been the GC at companies like Bloomtech, Cruise, Anki, and Amazon, where she worked on Alexa, another cool product. I don't know how much we're going to talk about that today, but that could probably be a whole other podcast in and of itself. She started her career at Morrison Foerster and at Yahoo. Thank you so much for joining me today for this episode of The Abstract.
Thanks, Tyler. Really excited to be here.
You talk about GCAI as being a product you always wanted. Can we just start by having you tell us a little bit about what you're building?
Of course, yeah. So GCAI is essentially an AI platform for in-house teams. And when I say something I always wanted, there's this concept in software of having empathy for the user. And for me, that's extreme because I am the user. Like in the past, it was shocking to me that legal software, by and large, has a reputation that it's not particularly usable. And as a software enthusiast, I love Slack. I use Grammarly. I use hundreds of different pieces of software a day. I thought, why can't we have software that's a joy for doing legal work? And so that's what we're building. And AI was really the big tech shift that to me makes that possible.
Your last role at Replit before you left to launch this is cool. It was a mix of sort of legal and business. I'm just generally interested in this founder journey. How do you feel like your years of leading legal teams, business teams too, prepared you for this moment in time and prepared you to launch your own company?
Yeah. So Replit is development platform for software engineers. So it's the integrated development environment, or IDE, where they spend most of their time. Think of it as like Microsoft Word, but for engineers. And what we were building there was really about, being that hub and using AI to help the core job of, in their case, creating software. So the realization that I had and what led me to found GCAI in part was, with AI, lawyers can have the same thing where, we have this very brainy job. Our stock in trade is words. So I hear that and I think, LLMs, large language models, that's the tech behind generative AI. And what are we as lawyers? We are large language models. Like literally, I tell this story, I swear, and I'm not even joking. We've all had this experience, right? Where you had to review something for compliance. And by the way, you notice 3 typos while you do it. I supported the CMO at one of my jobs. And he asked me very earnestly when we were at lunch one time, he's like, Cecilia, how did you get so good at copy editing? And I was like, well, maybe it's the 25 years of school and then the law firm and then whatever. And, we are I'm not particularly good at Excel, but my love language is words. And so that's what AI does. And so I had this realization of you take this tech that's made for language and a job, which is being a lawyer, that is really based on words, right? Case law is prose, contracts are prose, advice to clients, typically pros, although of course you should use emojis. We can talk about that separately. But like those things are all words. And so when I think about that, and I'm not the only one to have this realization. Obviously, AI is super hot for legal at this point among venture capitalists. It's considered consensus to have legal AI, but that was kind of the core realization. And Replit, I think, definitely helped me. I also think, and we can talk about this, that software engineers and lawyers we're more alike than we are different. And so, lots of learnings I had from the BD side of marketing to developers. Developers have an incredibly high BS meter. Who else has a high BS meter? Lawyers, right? So that was definitely an experience that between I and co-founder Bardia Porvakil, we had that. It's been an incredibly helpful experience to have that in our back pocket.
Okay, why should lawyers use emojis? You can't.
Yeah. So fascinating research on this. We can drop it in the show notes if that would be helpful. But basically, emojis improve recall tremendously. And one of the things that I've realized in-house, and I think this is different from law firms, is the law is like the table stakes. You got to get that right. You got to get the legal advice right. But as in-house counsel, landing your message and getting the stakeholder base to do whatever it is you're asking, it's kind of like sales, right? You have to move people. Like people don't naturally think, oh, I want to fill out a DPA. Like it's just not a thing. You have to influence them. And so using every tool in the toolkit, such as emojis, to me is something that it makes a measurable difference. And, I'll tell you, actually, we had a user of GCAI, and she's super into emojis, and she'll tell you this. When she's interacting with the sales team, supporting the commercial team, she'll have a legal update that she wants to provide, some new law regulation, what have you. And she'll ask GCAI to give her emojis and create the message in a very readable way. And her stakeholder base noticed, was like, Amy, your team is on fire lately with these incredibly clear updates. And that matches my experience almost 100%. And so I have an emoji keyboard installed. It's part of our brand. But the reason for that is that it's part of being an effective in-house lawyer is also coming to where the clients are, right? So for me, you mentioned I worked for Lambda School, I worked for Replit. They have a little bit of a Gen Z kind of bent to them. They're new tech companies. They are, these private stage, venture-backed, et cetera. So, I think I have a strong point of view on that. But I also think the rise of Notion, who I think you've had on the show, Hassani Caraway, Notion has exactly. They have a very very emoji forward point of view, right? Like to create a Notion page, you add an emoji. And both the research and my practical experience back that up. So lawyer tip, use emoji, try it. It's going to feel strange at first if you're not used to it, but particularly for internal communications, highly recommend.
I love that. Obviously, getting to the right answer is only half the battle, and being able to communicate it effectively is just as important. Another podcast guest, Dan Haley, and I talk a bit about this on his episode. He's really great at this. For our listeners,
he made a video. Like Dan Haley and I'm his friend too, and he mentioned that when long story short, his company at the time, Sprinkler, was having a hard time basically getting customers to accept their paper. Because it would be like these big procurement companies, Procter & Gamble, whatever, that wouldn't accept their paper. And they made a video that was like, here's why you got to accept our paper. And you can find this on the web. We can drop that in the show notes too. But the video is like this little, dancing whatever contract that's like, you should accept our paper because blah, blah, blah. But it makes the really compelling arguments. And he said to me, we talked about this offline, I don't know if you mentioned on the podcast, essentially the video reduced the amount of requests like 3x or some amazing stat.
Wow. Created by, actually, because I've done a webinar with him, a guy named Adam Stofsky and his company Briefly. They do animations. They're really cool. I say that just because I think it's a really cool way to think about communication about complex concepts or concepts that it might be tough to get non-legal stakeholders to pay attention to.
Yeah. Look, we're all, lawyers use TikTok too, right? Like people ask me I went to basically like a founders thing. And, the question was like, should you be using TikTok for marketing? We don't at GCI yet. We do use LinkedIn tremendously. But the question was like, who's on TikTok? Everybody's on TikTok. The world is on TikTok. So just because we're lawyers doesn't mean we're not people. And that's actually a funny story is that we had we're going over, I could tell it if you like.
Please. Yeah.
Yeah. So we had basically a product feature, and it was essentially, the product feature was basically making the answers a little bit more personal to the user, where it was like people would ask a question, and then it was like, okay, good job. I think the brief or whatever it is could be improved in this way. And we got a piece of feedback where the person, we have thumb up and thumb down in product. The person thumbed up it and said something like, "This answer made me feel good." And we get that back. And one of our engineers is like he was like really moved. He was like, wow, like this is really lovely. Because we sort of personify the AI a little bit. And he looks at me, and this engineer, he's like, well, I guess, I don't know why this surprises me, because lawyers are people too.
Right.
Yeah. Just like, yes, well, of course we're people. Like, what are you telling me about it? It was just this beautiful thing where it was like, I think this AI, when it has these like kind of like agentic, to use a technical term, agentic capabilities, where it does something for you, it interacts with you really on a human level. If we can infuse that into the product, where it's like, it doesn't have to be formal. It can be your assistant. And then, your interface with the world, you're filing in court, or you're filing with the SEC, what have you. Of course, you're going to put your lawyer voice on. But when you're doing the work, I think it can be just as effective to have that human element.
Yeah. I mean, that's actually not, maybe this is already part of GCAI's offering. You can even think of the role of the GC sometimes as telling members of their team, hey, this really needs to be 3 bullets, right? It can't be 3 paragraphs, and you can imagine, building that into a solution like what you've built. So that way, as GC, you might not have to be out there in the future sort of constantly providing that feedback to your team. It's being provided automatically based on the sort of guidelines or rules that you've set up. That's really cool.
I mean, that's one of the, honestly, that's our goal too, is really, because you also, over time, with effectively communicating internally, you also increase that influence, right? That all of us want. Like, all of us want to be invited to the table. Okay, how do you get invited to the table? Is like, you provide value, and you on the one hand, on the other hand, okay, that's fine. Do the analysis. But then it's like, you want the answer, right? And you want to be able to communicate in a way that instills trust, and obviously it has to be right. So all of this assumes the legal advice is correct. It's just like, how are you landing it? Are you thinking about the trade-offs that the team has? Sometimes you want to take a little bit more risk. Sometimes you don't. And, I actually had, speaking of user feedbacks, we're super driven by user feedback, very much the kind of Silicon Valley, move fast kind of model, but in a good way of like, I think Y Combinator, which is Paul Graham's company, which of course, invested in Airbnb and other famous ones. But his thing is make something people want. And so been thinking about it that way. But one of the user feedbacks that we got, and this almost made me cry, it said, with GCAI, my more junior team member is more strategic. Because they get into areas they're maybe not as comfortable with. They hash out the advice first with AI and then give it. And so to me, that was something I read that, I'm like, oh, this is why I'm doing this. And I just was like, I think, I'd had a bad day or something, and I got that feedback, and I swear to you, I was almost moved to tears.
I want to ask you a few other questions about the founder journey and being a founder of a business. You came out of companies or had experience at companies that were AI native, right? Or had AI products. Do you think that was really necessary for having the confidence to start a business like this? Because you're not like a large language model software engineer, data scientist, which is sort of the archetype for starting an AI company these days, I think. That's the first sort of question.
So I actually think AI makes it easier to found a company. So the core answer to your question is yes, but AI now, and back to Paul Graham would tell you this, that the knowledge and the depth in a domain, which I'm lucky enough to have in the domain of being an in-house counsel, and particularly being an in-house counsel for tech companies. Yes. Building a product that points AI at that, the domain expertise ends up being more important than the technical expertise. And what I think, yes, my AI experience, it's very fortuitous. Like, I don't take any of it for granted. I'm very, very lucky to have come to the Valley when I did, and timing plays a huge role. That being said, I actually think with AI now, you can move so fast because the feedback that we get, the product feedback, is, again, it's about the words, right? So we get, we have a channel where when somebody provides feedback, it goes to a mirrored copy. Otherwise, we don't see the chats because security, but it goes to a mirrored copy, and we look at it, and essentially, like, I know what a good legal answer looks like. I don't know the like underlying technology of how the tokens are being put together, but you have that knowledge. So I would say it's a little bit easier. That being said, like, I do think, risk tolerance, and then the ability to, I did okay financially. I worked hard for many years. I took steps down to have the GC experience. I could have basically made more money as a number 2 or, even a number X lawyer at bigger companies. And I still, a part of me dies when I think about the value of my stock options at Amazon that I left, of my stock at Amazon.
Yeah.
But you got to play the long game. I mean, taking this back to careers, like, careers are long. The valley is small. Like, for me, the entrepreneur thing, it was there, and I got lucky that the timing, worked out. But I definitely think, like, don't let people tell you, and this was a message that I think, Greg from Tech GC was talking about. Don't let people tell you you're just a lawyer. Particularly if you're in your house, you are not just a lawyer. And you're only just a lawyer if you think you're just a lawyer.
It's a mindset thing.
Exactly.
I've got a question that I like to ask folks who have made that leap, because I've been lucky to have a few of them on the podcast, from being a GC or being a lawyer to founding a company or being a CEO. Do you still feel like you're a lawyer? Do you feel like you've had a big mindset shift? I mean, there's a difference in sort of accountability, I think, when you're the CEO than when you're another member of the executive team, which includes being a GC. Talk to us about how you've sort of navigated that mindset shift.
Yeah, so I'll take that in 2 parts. I would say the first part of, like, do I still self-identify as a lawyer? Oh, broadly, yes. Like, I think this is where you get into the, the really good career advice that comes from improv, which is like, yes, and. Right. So yes, I'm a lawyer and I'm a CEO, right? Versus no, but. And that mindset shift of yes, and, total aside, complete career amplifier. Like, just look at everything as yes, and. Like, and, sometimes it'll be like, sometimes you want to say no and it's wrong or whatever. But in general, that's been an amplifier for me. So yes, I identify a lawyer and now I'm a CEO. But how are they different? In particular, you pointed to accountability. I think that's 100% correct. Like, I would say, I mean, I had a bunch of functions rolling up to me at Replit. I had BD, I had support, DevRel, and obviously legal and trust and safety. And so it was a lot of responsibility, but CEO is just different. I was talking to my spouse the other day, and it's like, every job in the company I kind of care about. Like, it used to be like, as legal, I could be like, oh, it's a finance thing. Like, I partner with finance, but it's like not really my problem, and it shouldn't be, right? Like, that wasn't my function. But now, like, we had a stutter step where, long story short, Stripe was like misreporting our revenue and showing undiscounted revenue as our revenue. Great, but it was accidentally showing it, higher than the number. Right. That's not a big thing. But, like, that's something where I'm like, I care about that, obviously. Yeah. And, like, oh, guess what? We're going to sign a contract. I care about that too. And it's just like this level of, like, figuring out that my role is really, like, making sure that all these other things happen. Legal absolutely has a component of that. But I would say it's amplified. And then, this whole thing of, like, okay, you don't want to treat a company as family, fine. But it is. It's our baby, right? Like, and I feel that so deeply, particularly as a founder CEO, that's different. And I had that as a lawyer too. I was always very much like, one of the pieces of advice I gave is it's always like, we, not they, right? Like, we want to launch this product, as opposed to even, some of the more junior attorneys I would mentor would come and be like, can you believe the engineering team wants to launch blah, 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 blah. They're crazy. Like, no. It's, we are launching this product. How are we going to make that happen? And that, to me, was a big thing with the rise of product counsel, is thinking of yourself as like, okay, you're the lawyer for Google Groups or whatever the product is. And, like, it doesn't matter if it's a copyright question or privacy question or whatever it is, like, your job is to get that product launched in a compliant way.
It's they're not your clients, basically.
Exactly. And I mean, even to the point where it was like calling them stakeholders. So that was a big thing at Cruise was, calling your individual attorneys the client as opposed to your individual people that you work with the client as opposed to the company at large. So actually, I think that Delaware weighed in on that. So yeah, it's a great point.
What's the steepest learning curve associated with being a founder? Like, is it fundraising?
Yeah,
is it hiring?
yeah.
Go ahead.
I would say fundraising, no, because actually as GC of venture-backed companies, I was relatively involved in that. And certainly, the actual deal mechanics of a lot of your listeners are probably deal people. So that's not a learning curve. But for me, the learning curve, the biggest one, honestly, is just embarrassing, but it's actually the finance side. I'm much more I would say I've always had strong partners in finance as a GC. So I've never really I know how to read a balance sheet, but kind of barely, so that's been probably a random thing, but it's also, we're really lucky at GCAI where I tell the team, I'm like, this is a champagne problem that we have more revenue that I know how to put on a spreadsheet, but it gets back to that mentality of okay, I don't look at the world as a spreadsheet. That's just not my personality. And I'm sure there are attorneys who do, right? So I have a friend who's a lifetime tax attorney and he is just brilliant with the spreadsheet, as brilliant as any finance person. For me, I came up as kind of product privacy counsel. It wasn't particularly math heavy. So even though I probably could have learned math or how to manipulate data better at some point, I didn't. So that's where I would say I'm learning the most. But other areas, I mean, I think it's all the typical startup lore. It's fun. It's fun that it's happening. Yes, hiring, to your point, hiring is exceptionally difficult. But it's kind of look, if you're a lawyer, let me give this confidence to your readers. If you can go to law school, succeed in law school, pass the bar, presumably work at some kind of firm, bill your hours, just all those things are really hard. And Tim Ferriss, who's he's really big on Twitter, and he writes basically the 4-Hour Workweek book, and his whole thing is do things that seem hard, because basically he says that paths to get rich that a lot of people take are actually the harder ones than entrepreneurial illness. So he makes the case that if being a lawyer is actually much harder than opening up becoming a car dealer. Right. I read something somewhere that some measurable percentage of the millionaires in the United States actually own car dealerships. And you're oh, okay, I could do that. Right. So it really is a confidence, trust you can do it. And I think this is why you see the trend of very high performing GCs being COOs, right? So Belinda Johnson, of course, and then there's of course Kristen at Lyft, and
another podcast,
lots and lots of folks. Oh, perfect. Yeah. So lots of your guests, you'll see that if you can be an effective GC, COO is not a big leap. It's very similar.
One of the things that I was hoping that we could do today is talk a little bit about how GCs, how legal teams should be thinking about AI, leveraging AI, et cetera. Besides subscribing to GCAI, how should in-house counsel, let's just start sort of broadly speaking, right? How should in-house counsel be thinking about leveraging AI around, what should they be asking outside counsel maybe, or should they be thinking about tooling internally, or is just should they just start with ChatGPT? What's the universe basically that we should be thinking about?
I think part of it is a mindset thing where it's yes, AI is sort of everywhere, and being able to separate the wheat from the chaff of okay, what can I actually, how do I get started? So my recommendation, if you've literally never even used AI, is to just cross that threshold of go to ChatGPT and ask it for, how to set up your kid's volleyball team or something something literally use it for personal use cases, because AIs have personality. So actually getting used to that and how they work and how it's different from a normal Google search, I would consider that to be sort of threshold knowledge. And then, and I'm not alone in this, by the way. So the ABA, the American Bar Association, which is the biggest professional organization in the world, I just learned 400,000 members.
Really?
Yeah, great, wild, right? 400,000 people, 500,000 people are part of the ABA.
Even I learned things on these podcasts.
Exactly, I know, right? It's I thought I knew all about legal too, but anyways, I heard that factoid the other day. But anyways, came out with guidance on AI, long awaited. And essentially, one of the pieces of guidance that they gave was to learn AI, like to literally learn about it. And so for me, like I teach classes. So like one of the things you can do is literally like take a class with, I think it could be with me, but there are others, and just play with it. And the actual literal data coming out from, I think it was LinkedIn and McKinsey each have reports that say that people who experiment with AI end up finding those use cases and then end up being having the higher productivity gains because they're sort of used to it. So for us, like our theory at GCAI is like, okay, take a class, use the product. And then there are legal use cases, of course, that all of us use, right? So like reviewing an NDA, we have an official prompt within GCAI to review an NDA. And that's something like an NDA, there's 13 things, the definition of confidential information, the exclusions, does it have residuals, whatever. There's a very set number of things. And so that's actually a really easy AI use case. Another is like your distillation. So I literally tell people like, go to GCAI, upload your privacy policy, tell it or link your privacy policy, give me, 14 FAQs about this privacy policy. And it'll just go for it and do it right. So these sort of like distillation is kind of what I would consider to be sort of your like first stair in the staircase of like, you're going to reach AI nirvana up here, right? Down here, you've got kind of like, okay, I just asked ChatGPT, for a recipe. Up here, you've got, I'm doing everything. We had a user do 258 chats in a week last week. So that was a record for us. Wow. But this person is asking everything in their department, like everything that they're doing. They were working on some compliance stuff, asking those questions. And, that person I would say is top 0.01%, right, in the adoption curve. But it's a vision to the future of like, okay, am I creating, prompts that I'm reusing? Am I thinking about like, okay, I'm launching this product or I'm going to be doing this filing or, we've got this initiative, the My Health, My Data Act just came out in Washington. Yep. I got to roll it out. Let me come up with a compliance plan using AI. Let me come up with FAQs using AI. Let me tell the business team a Slack using emojis, of course, using AI. So there's many things you can do. I think some people, the analogy that I use, and this might actually be helpful, is giving AI to a very trained lawyer, like an elite lawyer, like your listeners, where you were probably at a firm and now you're at a, in-house, is like giving a marathon runner a bicycle. Where like they already run a sub 2 hour marathon. They're really fast. You're going to come up to them and you're going to be like, hey, you want to wear these like strap shoes and you got to wear a helmet. And it's like, okay, like, and by the way, you need a good bike and whatever. Like, and by the way, there's possibly ethical issues with using this bike. Like, there's going to be a good percentage of marathon runners are going to be like, F you, like I'm just running. Yeah. But like the point is like the end goal is like, okay, if you give this elite athlete a bike, they can go more places, they can do different things, they can get off the bike when they got to climb, whatever. But like the point is they're still the rider, they're who's empowered. So AI in this scenario is the bike. And so I feel very strongly about that like my first advice is like, just try riding. And like, you can take a class, but in my class, the part that gets the highest reviews is the interactive prompting where I'm like, okay, go do this. Your company just got a letter from a senator, go summarize it and write a thing to the exec team. And I do like time tests. And I set a timer during the class. I'm like 3 minutes and I come back. I'm like, how do you feel? And people are like, that was really fast, but oh my God, I totally summarized my privacy policy in 3 minutes. You cannot do that just without AI. So like seeing that light bulb moment, to me, like getting to your light bulb moment quickly and getting your team to that's kind of, I would say that's level one.
The Abstract is brought to you by SpotDraft, an end-to-end contract lifecycle management system that helps high-performing legal teams become 10 times more efficient. If you spend hours every week drafting and reviewing contracts, worrying about being blindsided by renewals, or if you just want to streamline your contracting processes, SpotDraft is the right solution for you. From creating and managing templates and workflows to tracking approvals, e-signing, and reporting via an AI-powered repository, SpotDraft helps you in every stage of your contracting. And because it should work where you work, it integrates with all the tools your business already uses. SpotDraft is the key that unlocks the potential of your legal team. Make your contracting easier today at SpotDraft.com. I like this mindset that you're describing of test it and see if there, in other words, you don't have to use it for everything, right? Like you don't have to use it to research every single law. Maybe Gunderson or Cooley put out a great summary of my health, my data. And so you're not going to use it for that, right? But for, the new, Texas state privacy law, you are going to ask, hey, I don't really have time to read this thing. It's probably not as important. It's probably not as risky. Can you just do a quick scan of our privacy policy and see whether or not we generally align with the requirements of this law? Or you might not use it to like draft the letter to the senator, but maybe you took some meeting notes and you need to summarize them for the exec team. And so rather than sitting there and reading through a page and a half of notes, you can distill it into 7 bullets that you send around to folks. I think that's a great mindset of, hey, why don't you try it here and there? It doesn't need to be a part of every workflow initially, right?
Exactly.
Do you agree with that? Is that a fair?
1,000%. That's a very fair assessment. And on the letter to the senator example, by the way, you can go even further, right? So maybe you got a letter with other companies and you're debating, do you respond as a coalition or individually? Mm-hmm. And you're like, give me 3 pros, 3 cons, right? And AI can do that very well. And so this idea that like, once you start to think of it as your intern or as your associate, learning to delegate, learning to how the intern learns, these take a little bit of time, but again, on the research front, research has come out that people who are used to managing others tend to be better at AI. And so another thing that a lot of listeners talk about, or a lot of people talk about in law, legal teams, they're not huge engineering teams, right? So like at Amazon, you could be a level 7, which was basically, principal of the equivalent of principal of product management, a principal level. So above senior manager. You could be a senior manager, basically just below directors and have no reports. Versus a level 7 at Amazon who's an engineer, would have like 50 people, 60 people under them. So there's this craving for management experience. Okay, think about what can you delegate to AI, right? And thinking about how to delegate things and how to phrase your requests correctly, like that's prompting. And people ask me like, ooh, prompt engineering. Like I think calling it prompt engineering is doing a disservice. It's really like management delegation. And we have those skills as lawyers, and we should be building them if we don't. So exactly as you said, experiment. And then, the next level for us, we find that once somebody saves a prompt as their own in GCAI, that then essentially we looked at retention data and they retain. Like anybody who's ever saved their own prompt we've never had a cancellation of somebody who saved their own prompt. And so like something like that, where it's like once you reach that threshold level, you're past the like onesie twosie things and you've actually gotten to that next level. So getting your team to that next level. And we work with companies, like we had a customer the other day where essentially our CTO, he's amazing at prompting. And so he met with their commercial team and they had reviewed, their team in particular did a lot of a particular type of contract. It was events contracts, actually random, but their company does a lot of events. So essentially similar to what I said about NDAs, there's like 13 things in an NDA. Okay, an events contract, there's like 14. Like what are the insurance provisions, what or whatever. And okay, now they've created that prompt. And so every time they review an events contract, they're going to be saving 10 minutes, an hour, like pick your amount of time. But like once you start to see those both time savings and quality improvement, like you love it. And so like, I feel very passionate that's where the industry is going. It's just a matter of getting it into lawyers' hands.
The intern analogy, I think, is a good one because it also highlights the need often to check the outputs or check the work product. It's like if you have an intern create the first draft of a deck that you're going to be sending to probably not the border investors, but maybe the border investors, right? You're probably going to want to check the content of the deck. How do you counsel folks who are getting started with Gen AI on what do they need to check? How do they need to check it? Do they need to check everything? How do you handle the sort of objection of like, well, if I have to check everything, why should I even use this in the future? Right. At all. To talk us through that output piece and how do you actually use it like an intern piece?
Yeah. So the core advice on this is like, the full analogy that is how I give it is that AI is a smart, fast, occasionally overeager intern who has read the whole internet, right? So 6 pieces to that metaphor, all are relevant. But to your question, so hallucinations, so we can talk about that.
Yeah.
But basically, my thing is use a tool that reduces them. So data is very hard to come by here for reasons I can explain. But essentially, ChatGPT, the consumer version, for a variety of reasons, 1, trying to save tokens, 2, copyright, actually, it tends to paraphrase things a lot. And so when you use it to review a contract, you will see hallucinations, particularly with the less powerful model. So if you use GPT 3.5, nobody does that anymore. But back when that 4.0 was still cost money, people would say like, oh, you can't use it for legal. It hallucinates too much. So that is true. The more powerful models are a little bit better. But what happens is to save tokens, which is sort of the core unit of analysis in AI, OpenAI tends to abstract longer documents. Now, as you know, as a contracts person at a contracts company, you got to have the exact text, right?
Correct.
So customer shall assist is not a good paraphrasing of customer shall provide assistance upon the occurrence of A, B, C, and D, right? Because that is not the same thing, right? And so that's why we make the big bucks, right? That's why we're the wordsmiths. That's why lawyers are LLMs, right? So when you see errors like that, it comes down to just some fundamental things. And so I actually got asked recently by somebody, they said, hey, we like your training. Can you give the training on ChatGPT? And I ended up saying no, because I'm like, look, in order to get the good legal results, you need both a tool that has thought about this and the good prompting. And so the prompting that you said, like, at what point is it not worth it? Like, my thing, you can get okay results from ChatGPT, but you have to do, I call it artisan prompting. Like, you really have to be very specific with your intern of like, hey, you're a legal intern, and hey, go out to the web and check your answers, and hey, do this. Yeah. And it's just more than most people are willing to do, right? So back to my mixing my analogies crazily now, back to my bike example, it's like giving somebody like a unicycle, and you're like, okay, the unicycle, like you're going to like fall down, and like it's probably still faster than running, but it's like annoying. So I'm like, okay, let me give you like a Trek, like a fancy bike. That's what I would say GCAI is in this scenario. And there are others. Like I've heard good things about Ironclad's AI, SpotDraft. I know you guys are doing a ton of AI, and you have the advantage that the data is structured, right? So in that scenario, you're going to reduce hallucination just by virtue of the fact that like SpotDraft already knows what the indemnity provision is. And so you're not going to get hallucinations from the AI accidentally looking at the confidentiality provision. So like in that scenario, like I do make that recommendation of like using a dedicated tool. But then, in terms of like how do you deal with just other annoyances? I think this is something where you're going to lose that head start. You're going to lose that learning on AI if you wait for it to get good. So this is like the early adopter thing where it's like, basically if you wait for it to get to non-hallucination, you're probably like, a year or 2 away. And in that year, you could have been thinking of use cases. You could have been using it for all the cool stuff. And, by the way, obviously, I stand behind the product. This is why we generally do free trials. Get in there and use it side by side and see how you like it and ask the questions. But I think it's one of these things also where once you get a sense for when hallucinations happen. So pro tip, hallucinations are more likely when you tell the AI something exists that does not exist, because the AI is wanting to make you happy. So to the intern analogy. Right. So if you're like, hey, give me a case that says this, the AI is like, Johnson versus, Federer 195 F3rd 67. And it's just kind of because it thinks that you're like all knowing, right? So
good tennis analogy. I was a Federer fan.
There you go. Exactly.
And I think it's okay, by the way, to say AI can't do everything, and AI is not going to be right all the time. And it's a tool, and we still think that it's valuable, and we still think that you should start to embrace it, and we still think that you should start to use it. And yeah, like check the outputs, check the results, right? Like it's okay to be sort of a bit of an evangelist and also recognize its limitations.
That's exactly right. And that's why sometimes I in terms of these starter tasks, things where you already know the law. So those of you who are in your house, you know where you spike, right? So how many times have I given a privacy training? Hundreds, right? So I know exactly what it's going to have. It's just like, it's like slightly different, right? Because you're going to do a privacy training for customer care, or you're going to do a privacy training for, the ads team, whatever. Like things where you know what you want to say and you need help to say it. AI is that's the golden use case for AI right now. And so what you said is exactly like, that was a great way to put it.
A last sort of question for you on, AI and legal teams. I'm not only curious about how people who are already on legal teams should be embracing AI and using it and sort of getting ready for work looking a little different. I think you also, you've worn a GC hat before. You probably have an interesting perspective on, if you're a GC, is your hiring going to look different in the future now that you have AI, right? Are the types of employees or backgrounds that you're looking for going to be slightly different? Like maybe you can get by with more of a generalist who's empowered with AI as opposed to needing a variety of specialists. I don't know if that's right. I don't know if that's what you think, but I'm curious like, how do you think this is going to change the makeup of in-house teams?
Yeah. So I think what you said is right. And I think it's not only a trend of law. I think it's a trend overall where even the Navy, again, I'm just like so passionate about this. The Navy on a ship, on a submarine, it used to be they had a specific person to do every little thing, right? But as systems become more advanced and more electronic, it's much more about like troubleshooting many systems versus have one person do this particular thing. And what it points to is really like the rise of the generalist. And, other scholars have thought about this out of MIT, out of other places, but in legal, I do think, the term general counsel, of course, like the way I see it is that you need a T shape or, a pie shape, right? With two T's. But anyways, like a T shape. For me, that was IP and privacy. And so, but when I became a GC, of course I had to pick up corporate. Of course I had to pick up employment and other areas. But for employment law in particular, like, yes, it varies by state. But as an attorney, a lot of these judgment calls, like you can start to use AI or use, actually look at the law straight and bring an outside counsel of like, okay, we've got a judgment to call. We've got a super gnarly issue in Idaho or what have you. But your basic question of like, okay, in Idaho, if you have a termination in Idaho, do they get their paycheck on their last day, or like California, or is it okay to pay them, in 10 days or whenever their next normal paycheck would be? So the answer is actually the latter. But anyways, the point is like a question like that, if you've got access to the internet or you've got access to an AI, you can answer that yourself without going to counsel. So like this kind of thing. And then like having somebody and this is something every company I've worked for, so from Amazon to Replit, and I think Stripe has this value as well, has curiosity as a core value. Yes. And for me, I was talking with somebody, so I was actually talking with maybe another guest of yours about what makes a good product counsel. And his point of view was that the best product counsel are M&A lawyers. And I was like, okay, that's peculiar. Explain. And he said, M&A lawyers are curious AF. They can get up to speed in a new area very quickly because they're used to researching whatever issue of the thing. And he's like, they work super hard and they're super diligent. They pick up a lot of information quickly. So he's like, I've hired 6 M&A lawyers to my company. All of them are the best product counsel you've ever met. I said, interesting. Okay, cool. I thought that was fascinating. For me, I think it's litigators. Like, I'm biased. I think the best product counsel are commonly former litigators. But anyways, that ability. Also
curious, though.
Exactly.
Right?
Curious, right? So when I was a litigator, you become an expert in that case. Like, I became an expert on pharmaceutical proteins when I was on a patent case at MoFo, to the point where, like, it was like ASP9, and I know how the proteins branched in that patent case. And so, like, that ability to absorb new areas of law, I've seen it a lot in tech, but I think it's also an important hiring criteria overall. And those are the folks that are into AI and will use whatever it is they can to satiate that knowledge, to follow that curiosity to get the job done. So yeah, I mean, to me, I think like that's a hiring philosophy I sort of have it anyway. We had at Lambda School or now Bloom Tech, our head of compliance actually came into the company as the CEO's EA, but she showed an incredible affinity for compliance. There was no form she didn't like. And so I literally pulled her over initially as a compliance manager. And then now I think she's senior manager of compliance, and she runs basically a 50-state compliance program for the company. So, and I've worked with a lot of compliance folks in my career, and I would definitely put her among the best.
I love this value of curiosity. I think it's super important. I did an episode with Evan Furl, who now has his own small investment fund that was largely focused on sort of the role of creativity and curiosity in legal and how important that could be. And I will ask you for your book recommendations too in just a minute as we start to wrap up. But one that I think I've talked about before on the podcast, other folks have recommended, is called Range by David Epstein. And it is a great sort of book that I think is it's good for GCs to read, because they often feel like they're sort of, I think, caught between a lot of different worlds, and they worry that they've stepped away from being a specialist because they probably had that opportunity to become a partner potentially at a law firm in which things were very secure and specialized. And this book talks, as you point out, about all of the sort of social science and psychology research that supports the idea that having a variety of different experiences, or having 2 or 3 different areas of domain expertise, is actually where the real creativity happens and actually where real insight occurs. You can be a specialist and you can have insight, but sometimes the hardest problems can't be solved by those folks. Sometimes it has to be solved by someone who sees, I don't know, the dark side of the moon and the light side of the moon too.
For sure. Yeah, for sure. Look, I mean, and I do want to, in defense of specialists. So another friend of mine, I 1,000% agree. Sam Altman says the same thing, because he's like, if you want to be top 1% in the world in one field, you're Roger Federer. Yeah. It is mathematically very, very difficult. But if you can actually have 2 fields and kind of get yourself in that Venn diagram, the matchups, you already increase your odds more than twice to be top 1%, right? So he makes that argument, and I would definitely agree with that. So for me, it's law and tech, right? So people that have a background in law, there's a lot of lawyers, and, only 9 members of the Supreme Court, at least as of this writing. But I have a good story on that too. But separately, there's a lot of general counsels. There's not many more general counsels than our Supreme Court members, right? So you are experts. If you can be an expert in your business and an expert lawyer together, to me, that definitely drew me in-house. But separately, in defense of specialists, so I have a friend of mine, she has an SEC practice, and she spent 10 years at the SEC. So, she literally, she had subpoena power during that time. She, securities law, she knows both the practical aspects of the actual, Securities and Exchange Act, and then the actual ability to advise companies. That's what she's doing now. And she is classic big law partner, $1,600 an hour. Her name's Rebecca Fike at Vincent Elkins. If you ever have a security matter, give her a call, because she is absolutely worth whatever it is she's billing at. But for me as a GC, I'm thinking, okay, I'm using AI, and then if I actually have the issue and I need to negotiate with the SEC, okay, I'm calling Rebecca immediately. That's kind of, I see that. I do see this sort of hyper specialization at the firm and generalization. And by the way, more are going in-house, right? So in-house has grown tremendously, 7.5 times the rate of outside counsel in the last 25 years. So there's an awesome graph. Again, we can put it in the show notes, but there's an awesome graph on that that I can share. But those of you thinking in-house, is this a good opportunity, et cetera, it's growing a lot because companies are looking for people that can solve their problems, right? And so, we are definitely seeing that displacement.
Last question before I got some fun ones, and it should be easy. You teach a class at Stanford. You mentioned the class that you teach on Maven. If folks want to learn more from you about how to do AI prompting and use AI, where can they find you?
Yeah, so our website is getgc.ai. You can also Google my name. It's kind of unusual enough that you'll get me, but
Yes.
essentially I would say getgc.ai. I can, if you mention in your, so when you send a demo request, you'll get an email back. If you mention that you heard about it on the pod, we can work out a discount or something, but we can do something for that. But I'd love to have you try it. Like, again, my thing I push on it is like, get in there and experiment and try the product, like do a couple of things, you kind of owe it to yourself. And honestly, now there's another, on the classes point in February, the California Bar is launching a specialist credit for CLE. So we've got substance abuse, elimination of bias. They're launching one for technology. And we got that credit. So if you're looking for that CLE, you can kind of use that as an excuse to play around with AI. So that would be my other recommendation.
Cool. Some fun questions for you now. What's your favorite?
This has all been fun, Tyler. Like, this is really, thank you for having me. I love it. I could talk all day about this stuff, and I do.
This is a real conversation, which I love. For those, nobody's keeping track at home except for me. We've gone off script like 70 times so far.
Fire. I love it. So
good. What's your favorite part of your day-to-day or your routine?
Definitely the user feedback. So I'm going to come back to that. So I mean, for me, when I was at Amazon, it was the kind of customer obsession, and that's a value that I've brought throughout my career and been able to achieve. But for me, like making a product, it's kind of like the feeling is very similar to like when you write a really good brief as a litigator and the court, cites your stuff exactly, or you write an amicus brief and it's mentioned and you're like, this is amazing. And it's very similar. For us, we launched a new feature called Easy Prompt, where basically you can put in your prompt and we'll make it into like a nicely formatted kind of prompt engineering style prompt. And literally, I'm not joking. A user was like, I want to marry this feature. And I was like, I want to marry you too. And so that's definitely my favorite part of the job. Lots of favorite things, the team, getting to talk with folks like you. Like, I mean, I there's lots of things I like, but that's a single favorite.
How about a professional pet peeve? I think this is kind of a funny question.
Professional pet peeve. Let's see. I would say, even though I appreciate the hustle, because now I'm selling, but the unqualified LinkedIn reach outs are so funny and ridiculous that, like, I mean, sometimes I had one where it was like, they reached out to sell me something, and then they continued with the drip campaign that was like, did I miss you? Did I miss you? Did I get something wrong? Do you hate me? And it was like it kind of like devolved into these like multiple levels of like passive aggression. And I was like, okay, like this now that's a pet peeve, but I think they're kind of funny. So I guess I'm like not that annoyed about it, but I would say that's my professional pet peeve.
And now you have an opportunity, someday very soon or right now to teach some salespeople how to sell to lawyers a little better.
Yeah. Look, I mean, I definitely think like, it's sales. Sales is definitely an art. And I've learned so much about it. I have a post cooking on social media about like random sales terms. I heard the term today in sales. There's a term called happy ears. And it's for a salesperson that kind of hears things that are happy. And I was like, that's me. I have happy ears. I think everybody should use AI. So when I'm talking to somebody, they're like, they mention something. I'm like, oh yeah, let's use AI.
I love that.
So, yeah.
Happy ears.
Exactly.
I've mentioned a book today that I think folks should pick up and read based on our conversation. Doesn't have to be based on our conversation, though. If there's a book that you've read recently or that you think is really important to your professional journey that you'd like to recommend to our audience, I'd love your ideas.
So many. I think, so there's one that I read almost 10 years ago, but it really had me thinking about how a lot influence and the ability to influence make a big difference in your life. So it's called To Sell is Human, and it's a psychologist named Dan Pink. And one of the points he makes is that every job, including education, by the way, he's like, teachers are sales. You have to sell the knowledge. You have to sell the desire to learn. And thinking about sales in that way, as opposed to like, okay, you're a shady salesperson reaching out to me on LinkedIn, like thinking about it as influence and getting things done, I would say that's been very influential to me. The other one is a scholar named Jeffrey Pfeiffer out of Stanford, and he wrote a book called The Rules of Power. And power is kind of, the other one I would say is Deb Liu, who also wrote a book called Take Back Your Power. Deb was a student of Jeffrey Pfeiffer. But essentially, Jeffrey Pfeiffer's point is like achieving outsized levels of success is really at some point about knowing human dynamics. And, he uses examples from Trump, who, obviously like, disagreeing with his politics, which I do, but thinking about like, how did he use power dynamics and media moments and, essentially display, in some cases, very physically power. And how can you do that? So, that was something super interesting. It also is fascinating to me, particularly in a venture-backed company context, because you've seen what a company's valuation is. You could argue it's a number pulled out of thin air. So like you have to believe and you have to display power, and he gets into that. And he teaches a class at Stanford, Professor Pfeiffer does, that is oversubscribed every semester, that is basically on that, and talks about essentially the interpersonal dynamics for any job, no matter the substance, are really important to learn. So I would say that those two books, To Sell is Human and then Power, The Rules of Power by Jeffrey Pfeiffer. And then secondarily, I think also for women, and particularly women of color, the book Take Back Your Power by Deb Liu. I admire her a ton. She has a Substack. She's the CEO of Ancestry.com, came up as a product manager at Meta. And that's I really, really enjoyed that one too.
Great recommendations. And I love that there's so little overlap between the guests, an indication that there's so many great books out there to read.
Oh, I mean, this gets to the curiosity point. Like, I still genuinely believe, Obama read a book a week during his presidency.
Yeah. Did he really?
Which is like, it's like shocking, right? And so like something like that where I want my leaders to always be learning, just in general. And something that I try to live myself now a little bit more on Twitter or podcasts, but other podcast recommendation for folks in-house. There's a podcast called Acquired. And
that's a great one.
It's deep dives on companies and just learning the dynamics. And their tagline is every company has a story. And I think that's true.
Last question for you, my traditional closing question for guests. And that's if you could look back on your days of being a young lawyer, just getting started out of law school, something that you know now that you wish that you'd known back then.
I would say, I would put it probably in a message of comfort that as long as you put one foot in front of the other, you have that curiosity and drive, it will work out. Like, I literally remember I was debating between an offer at one firm and another, and I was like almost in tears of like, well, do I want a New York-based firm or a California-based firm? And like, and I look at that now, and it's like almost ridiculous. Where it's like, okay, if I'd have gone to the other firm, I would be fine. Like, and I did one and I did the other. Like, it literally is like that diligence and the kind of lawyer I became and what I did. Like, there would be slight variances. But there's no like any one decision. This is maybe the Amazon one-way door thing. What's the worst case scenario? Like, even for me at this company, like, I have every confidence it's going to succeed and we're going to be a unicorn. But even if we're not, like, I'm a really dang good lawyer. So like, can I go back to being a GC lawyer? Yes, I could do that tomorrow. So I would say it's that confidence that any one decision is not a one-way door.
I love that way to put it. Similar sentiment to what we've heard from a variety of other folks who've become founders, started businesses. But I love that analogy or that phrase of, one door is not one door. Actually, there may be other doors after it. That's fantastic.
Exactly.
Cecilia, thank you so much for joining this episode of The Abstract. This has been a lot of fun for me.
Oh, same. I literally I feel like it's like we were just talking at a party or something. I love it. Thank you so much, Tyler. This was so fun.
And to all of our listeners, thanks so much for tuning in to this episode of The Abstract, and we hope to see you next time.